kind of theme with Michael Meade's readings here. The last time he did this for his extraordinary book, The World Behind the World, it was on 9/11 2 years ago. So we're here on 11/11, and I don't know if we'll get to do 13/11 or not for the next time around. But there's something in the air with his evenings here, and I say here. I also want to welcome you tonight. I know from people finding and feeling their way in our still new home. This is the first time to our new home for many of you, and including Michael. So we say a particular welcome. We're very much keen to keep going and doing the kinds of things we were all those years in Pioneer Square here, and your presence here tonight is part of that, and certainly as well as Michael's. Tonight marks also, I think, one of the first nights, as Michael, as many of you know, makes the rounds, generally doing stories with drum, with and poems. Tonight is occasioned by the publication of an amazing book that's just come out, and it's except for the publication kind of celebration that happened last month or late September, this evening for his new book, Fate and Destiny, The Two Agreements of the Soul, will actually feature more of Michael really reading than is usually the case. And I still goes back to my memory of him in 1993 when The Water of Life in its initial life was published, and we had him at Elliott Bay for that. And again, after years of seeing him talk and hold forth, it was this different thing that happened with actually reading something off the page. I will say the things that I've seen, both what Michael's work on the page and his reading of it, The World Behind the World's reading 2 years ago was mesmerizing, because there's a language that gets written down as fine and eloquent as his story language is. There's some beautiful precision that sometimes the ear won't catch, but the eye does. And if you're listening carefully to him tonight, you will catch it, because the writing does have the ear in it, but there's also these close places. There's places where go and grow go very closely together, or there's a few others. There's just many others, these pairings of terms that set in all sorts of things in motion, as indeed are set in motion by very much what he's writing about, the notions of the very linked and twined notions of fate and destiny. Some of that was worked on in one of the many CDs that Michael's done and as Mosaic have done, and these get elaborated and built upon here. There's over 20 stories, myths, folk tales included in this book, as well as very personal stories. The very story of how fateful or destiny, or those mix of those things that it was that a certain book got into his hand at age 13. And where that's led since. It's a book that I think any one of us, as we read, there's so many things that it'll touch on in one's own life, as well as looking around more collectively. Tonight is part of a lot of getting around by Michael and Jacob and others from Mosaic. We're here tonight at Elliott Bay. Tomorrow night to be in Port Townsend. There's a Saturday workshop in Port Townsend, which actually there's information on chairs or over here at the table. Besides the copies of Michael's books, which are for sale at our Elliott Bay's table, there is a table for Mosaic with CDs with other information on what they are up to and will be up to, because it's also Mosaic's a nonprofit or a group that does valuable work in working with young people, veterans, to especially mention tonight, and all sorts of others that they've been doing for years, and it's vital work, as many of you know. Michael will read, and we'll take questions, I think, at the end for a bit of chance of conversation, and then following that, he'll be over at the table to sign copies of his books. With that, we thank you again for being here tonight, and I'll ask you to please join in welcoming Michael Meade.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for coming out on such a wet and stormy night. I wanted to, I'm going to read from 3 books, not all of the books, but I'm going to touch on things in 3 books. They're the 3 most recent books by Greenfire Press. The first one is called Voices of Vets, and I just wanted to acknowledge and pay some respect to the veterans. I know there are a few in the room, and there are too many in the world, and there's all kinds of problems that go along with it. Um, and a couple years ago, we did a retreat with a group of veterans and their families, and this is out of that came some poems, and so this is something from that book. This is a man named Bob Eaton, who went to Vietnam. I think he lied about his age in order to go. And then he's been trying to come back ever since. The modern world is very unwelcoming. I've studied rituals from different cultures and ceremonies and tribal attitudes, and it really begins with birth, the lack of welcome. Because even in the new book, I have a little section, a story that includes the birth and how the genius enters the world at birth, but it includes just a little bit of description about how in Guatemala, the whole village would welcome each one that was born, and everybody would be present for the naming ceremony. And the reason for that was because each one born is bringing a gift to the world. That's part of what the destiny idea means. And so the gifts are to be given to the community. So the community used to be busy welcoming everybody in because eventually they were going to receive gifts from this person. So it really begins in the modern world, I think, with birth, where we're not fully welcomed, and then it continues through childhood and youth. And then if you go off and have some kind of life-changing experience, which I call fate, then usually there's no one there to welcome you back, even though you have gone through some great ordeal, accident, illness, loss, and your whole life has changed. Goes unmarked, typically by the world around us, and that causes a certain kind of distance and isolation in the soul. And so Bob Eaton, after being in Vietnam, came back very, very broken. By the time we met him, he was probably 38 years into experiencing his own post-traumatic stress disorder. And he had never spoken much about it, and he had never gotten back to the dream of his life, which was to make music, to write songs and sing songs. And he had never done it. That was his dream. He went to war, was so broken, he could never do it. And so on the occasion of us all working together, he, for the first time, finished a song and sang it to everybody. And I just want to read a little bit of his song. It's called Coming Back on Me. They're coming home, feeling all alone. The 1,000-yard stare, and no one there. They want to tell about it, but no one cares. Happened once before in a far-off land. Was a nightmare called Vietnam. Now I see it all happening again. Got my mind in a deep spin. Going are the soldiers of the Great War, Korea and Nam. We stand at the door. And every day I see the young faces of the Gulf War vets, claiming their places in a long line. Memories of war are so unkind. Powers that be, why can't you see? You just can't win a war with no end. I watch it all from afar. The time is different, but not the war. Thought I had it all behind me, but watching this war, it's all coming back on me, like the wind on the desert and the waves on the sea. Just can't stop those old war memories from coming back on me. It goes on, but you get the idea. So that was his first song. It's kind of a blues song. He sang it that day, and then a few days later he sang it in front of 600 people that came out to welcome that group of veterans back. And that began his career. And now he travels around writing songs and singing them in a blues form about war and about life and about getting healthy. And he has finally captured his dream that was so broken and discarded when he went to war. And he's found, you could say, his thread of destiny. One other one. This is another Vietnam vet. And this was a response to the work we were doing together, his way of summing up this idea. Create a village as strong as a war, to pick the maggots off our skin and burnish the gold that lies within. Then there will be new strength in our sacred core. But can we create a village as strong as a war? So, it's kind of a challenge. Can we live in a way that's as strong, as deep, as life-altering as war? And one of the ways I'm suggesting that a person could try to do that is by facing one's fate and finding the hidden destiny that's in the fate and then living that. That maybe that, on an individual basis, were it to accumulate, might be enough ballast of healthiness to offset what seems to be the ever ongoing war. So, like Rick mentioned last time we were here on 9/11, it was for this book, The World Behind the World, which is my attempt to, through folktales and myths, answer the question, is the world going to end? The good news is mythologically the world can't end. As a matter of fact, the word end doesn't mean goodbye, good night, finito, it's all over. The word end means loose end or tail end, or technically it means remnant. And so no matter how bad it gets, there's always a remnant and a loose end from which it all starts over again. And so this book is largely stories of how the world keeps remaking itself from its own ashes and from its own devastation. And I just wanted to read this little part because it sets up the next book, Fate and Destiny. While eruptions in nature and disruptions of culture tend to produce nightmare scenarios and apocalyptic visions, something deep in the soul of humanity also responds to this roaring at the end of the world. Great crises and impossible demands often provoke hidden resources and reveal hints of the underlying wholeness and unity of life. The threat of collapse and utter loss can provoke a deeper sense of wholeness where nothing but our total involvement and wholeheartedness can work. The point of Apocalypse Now may be a deeper initiation of the creative self within each person. When everything outside tends to fall apart, the hidden unity inside life may be closer to the surface and calling for our attention. The Western world, so dedicated to materialism and outer life and the underlying indwelling sense of the unifying principle and guiding force of each life. I think I skipped a part of that. The West, so dedicated to materialism and the outer realm, may find more solace through revelations of the deep self within the individual and the underlying indwelling sense of a unifying principle and guiding force in life. In the midst of radical changes in nature and the rattling of cultural institutions, the point may be to turn again to the inner realm where old practices and deep awareness can produce moments of wholeness. When the whole thing seems about to fall apart, revelations of the deep self within may be closer than ever. Rather than the need to save the whole world, the real work of humanity may be to find some wholeness within ourselves, moment to moment. So that's the idea there. And I was saying in that book, there's always two big stories going on. There's the story of the world, which is partly mythological and partly historical and partly cultural. And then there's a story of the individuals living in the world, and they're both essential stories. I'm not sure who originally said it, but all history is made inside the individual soul. There is no history outside of the individuals. There is no culture outside of the individuals, even though people now refer to it as if it was out there somewhere. Culture is made, reinvented, reimagined, and remade in the individual soul, and so is history. And so I wrote this book about fate and destiny. And I'm not sure what to read from it. I marked a few things. I was riding over on the ferry going, I could read that. And so I'll try not to do all of that, but maybe a little sense of what it is. Fate inscribes an area or territory that we are bound to enter. Destiny involves finding a way out or a way through exactly those areas and aspects that constrain the vitality of our lives. Fate places us in specific contexts where meaning and purpose can be explored. Wherever we brush against the limits of our fate, we also stand near the doors of our destiny. When we face our fate in life, we also begin to move it, and when fate moves, destiny moves closer to us. Only from the ground of destiny does an individual life make sense. I'm going to reread that because I'm trying to test it out, you know. What happens to me is I write a book in a kind of a frenzy. This book I wrote in 3 months of just frenzied writing, and then we send it off to the printer, which happens to be in northern Minnesota, where there's a lot of Lutherans. And so when we get the book back, I'm always reading it to find out whether they change stuff in the book. In this particular book, I argue against tabula rasa, which is the old Christian notion that the soul is a blank slate. And I'm arguing that the soul is seated with the story from before birth. And so I'm worried that the Lutherans went in and tried to change stuff, stick the tabula rasa back in. Only from the ground of destiny does an individual life make sense. Taken together, fate and destiny are purpose seen from the other end of life. So this is another old idea. If you stand at the end of your life, which could be any day you happen to stop to consider things, and look back, fate is purpose seen from the other end. The idea that towards the end of one's life, a person can look back and draw the thread through and see that it was an inner design trying to be revealed throughout one's life. This is the old notion of what the soul is about. We have an appointment with destiny, but we must suffer the disappointments of fate in order to arrive there. Fate would stop us in our tracks and strip us to the bone so that we might discover the essential imagination and meaning and purpose that lies at the core of our lives. When we ignore the limits of fate and the hints of destiny, we tighten the unconscious level of our lives. Eventually, we make our lives fixed, settled, and intractable. Thus, we seal our own fate while ignoring our hidden destiny. Fate can mean it has been written. That's one of the translations of fate. Yet the inner story that our fate inscribes is a living text and a breathing record that is open to interpretation and subject to change. Fate is the story of our lives unfolding from within us. When life is fully lived, fate functions more as an oracle needing interpretation than as a predetermined outcome. I'm arguing there against the 19th century notion of fate as something predetermined, and because that is not defensible, fate was then dismissed. And that goes along with the idea of the accidental universe, which is very popular now, right? You followed that story? At first they thought the Earth was in the center of the universe, and then someone invented a telescope, and they said, whoops, it's not really in the center, but the sun's in the center. And then they invented a better telescope, and they looked and they said, whoops, it's not really, and then they said there is no center. And then they drew a very radical conclusion: because there's no center, the whole thing is an accident, and because we happen to be born here, we are accidents also. I'm arguing against that. I think it's a serious difference of opinion. If a person is an accident, then it doesn't matter what happens to us. If we are born with an inner design, a destiny, a purpose, an aim to our soul, it matters a lot what happened to us, and it matters to the world what happens to us. That's what I'm arguing against. When life is fully lived, fate functions more as an oracle needing interpretation than a predetermined outcome. Shifting fate and finding destiny within it is part of the art of truly living and of living truly. Fate and destiny are close woven with What is that?
Fate or is that destiny?
That was just a little of the clumsiness of fate. I don't think there's a destiny in it, but I don't know. It remains to be seen.
Either
Fate.
way, it was an accident.
Right. That's right. And the difference between an accident and fate is the accident that is not accidental. That's the difference. That wasn't accidental. fate and destiny are close woven within us, and near them can be found the true genius of our lives. Genius refers to the inborn spirit and innate style of each person, the spirit that is already there. The word genius comes from the North African word genie, which means the spirit that's already there. So part of one's fate and eventually one's destiny is that each soul enters the world with its own genius. The modern interpretation is genius is anyone with an IQ over 130, I think, which begins to exclude a whole lot of people. The old idea of genius is everybody has one. Everybody is naturally a genius in some way, in their way. Genius is part of how someone's life is styled. And when we live in the style of our own soul, we produce, we display, and we reveal our genius. And one of the meanings of destiny is to be seen standing with your genius. And so that's one of the great satisfactions. In ancient Greece, this is somewhere in the book, the word for happiness is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Daimon is the Greek word for genius. The daimon is the genius born with us. Happiness is eudaimonia. In other words, we're most happy when we make the genius we were born with happy. When we fulfill our destiny, we find the greatest happiness because the genius in us is fulfilled. The natural genius in us protects and reminds us of the innate gifts we carry and of a primary agreement our souls have made to deliver those gifts to the world. There's a chapter in the book where I take this story from Africa, love this little story, which talks about how the soul begins to move towards the world with a purpose and with gifts, but just before being born, because of something that's explained in the story, it forgets why it's coming to the world. So we have a purpose, but in order to take on a body, we have to forget why we came. So then we're born into a family, that didn't expect us. They were hoping for something else usually, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm talking about my family, and so then they try to turn us into what they thought they needed, and then school continues that process, and culture does that. And in the meantime, inside us is this genius waiting to be called into the game, called into play, and waiting to be recognized. We'll get to that later. The soul arrives gifted and aimed and dedicated to fulfilling its first agreement with life. But the labor of being born and the necessity of entering the realm of time and expediency causes us to forget the divine errand that the soul agreed to fulfill. So one of the things about mythology is it involves gods and goddesses and things that are eternal and divine. And eventually you just have to talk about it that way. So throughout the book, I start talking about each soul being on a divine errand. And this isn't a theological idea. It's a mythological idea, because the thing in us that we bring into the world that is part of the genius and part of the purpose is something we bring from eternity. Eternity is everything except linear time. You know what I'm saying? People are always talking now about running out of time, and I always say, well, listen, just go visit eternity and you can replenish, because that's where all time comes from. It's a mythological joke. You didn't get that. You see, we're not running out of time, we're just out of touch with eternity. And the part of us that's closest to eternity is this agreement we made before we were born, and the genius of the soul. So once you realize that it's something from the eternal world that we're carrying into this world, then it's very easy to begin calling it our divine errand, the errand that the divine has sent us on. And again, when it finds some kind of fulfillment, there is a kind of divine delight in that. So the whole book is moving towards that. And in the very beginning, I realized I had to give a little bit of credentials or something. Why am I writing about this? And so I had to start somewhere. That's one of the problems with writing or a book. You have to start somewhere and you have to end somewhere. These are two of the big difficulties in writing. So I wound up starting on my 13th birthday. And the reason for that was, I'll give you the oral version. It's written out in the book. But I had learned well before I was 13 not to ask for what I wanted. You know, I don't know about you, but I grew up in a family where if I wasn't going to get what I asked for, that was very clear. Um, you know what I'm saying? I mean, primarily because of poverty. You know, the family didn't have any money. So then if you asked for it, two things would happen. One, you wouldn't get it. And two, everyone in the family, all the adults, the parents, would feel bad for 2.5 weeks because of the realization of the pain that was being carried and the unfulfilled dreams that were hidden inside the closets throughout the house. And so I learned not to ask for those things. And not to anticipate much in terms of a birthday. But my aunt asked me what I was interested in at the time. And I said history, because I was reading history. I was a studious little troublemaker. And those are my two practices, study and making trouble. And so she went off to get me a history book. And as far as I know, that's the first person in my family that ever went into a bookstore. I'm pretty sure of that. And she was notoriously short, like 4'7", I think. And so she asked, this, I'm gathering this from her later on. She asked where are the history books, and they pointed like there. And then she went over and she saw one and she reached up, but she was short and she probably had to go like that. And then the hand of fate moved her hand and she grabbed another book and she took it over, didn't look at it. They wrapped it. She came and she gave it to me. I tore the paper off and she said, "Oh no, it's the wrong book. It's a mistake. I'll take it back." I'm looking at it, and what I see is the flying horse Pegasus flying across the page with an archer on his back shooting an arrow over his shoulder. And I'm going, "No, I want this book." And she said, "But it's the wrong book." And I said, "I want it." And I tear the rest of the paper off, and at the bottom it says mythology, Edith Hamilton. So it's the wrong book, it's the right book, it's the book of fate, it's the book of destiny. I mean, my life turns out to be about stories. And so that's what's in the first chapter. I'll read just a little bit of it. That's the setup. Early in the text, I read it all that night, almost the entire book. Stayed up most of the night, just blown away, transported, transfixed, transcended by this language and this imagination that was so different from I'm sorry to say it, the meanness of the streets where I was growing up. Early in the text, I encountered the idea that the early tellers of myth transformed a world of fear into a world of beauty. That's a quote from her book. Transformed a world of fear into a world of beauty. I wanted to be part of that transformation. I was standing at the end of childhood and in the uncertainty of my own unformed identity. I feared that I would be trapped in life the way most grown people seem to be. I feared that the same forces that made my family and neighborhood feel confined and narrow would capture and entrap me. I knew that my father felt burdened by the repetition of days and years spent driving a truck through the narrow streets of Manhattan, each day spent loading and unloading freight like Sisyphus pushing rocks up a mountain, only to find them waiting at the bottom again the next day. I knew that my mother dreamed of some other life, one more luxurious and less encumbered with 5 children. I saw the barely hidden anguish behind the effervescent facade of the neighborhood tavern where all our parents socialized, either soothing their souls or else troubling them further. Despite I go into a little background because I'm trying to talk about inherited fate, family fate, and the things that we didn't choose, the family, the style of the family. There's a thing called inherited fate that moves down secretly inside families and tries to get dealt with, and each child gets a little piece of that inherited fate. And part of the fate seemed to me to be born into this particular neighborhood and into some of the issues there. So I'm trying to give a little feeling of it at the beginning here. Despite the local bravado, we lived under a mean rule within a poverty that included the hollowness of actual hunger, but just as often a spiritual emptiness. By the age of 13, I feared that what I observed in those around me would be what I had to become. I loved my family, yet there was a double bind that went with the bonds of that love. Part of me was already looking for a way out of the family fate and the weight of collapsed dreams. This is how I was talking to myself about what was wrong in the family. Nowadays, you might call it depression or something. I saw it as collapsed dreams. I'll go into a little section here about the glam and the gloom of Ireland, but I think I'll skip that. I want to get to another part, but so I get this book. This is my 13th birthday, and I'm introduced to the world of mythology, which turns out to be the world that I'm going to live in the rest of my life. I don't understand that, but I'm taken by it. 6 months later, I have another experience. Looking back, I understand that the word myth comes from the Greek muthos, and muthos has two meanings: to know the myth and to tell the myth. So on my 13th birthday, for the first time, I knew the myth in the sense that I read them and I knew something about them, and I continued to read them after that. And then 6 months later, I have another experience where I'm cornered in this bathroom at the back of a movie theater by this rival older gang who have brought me in there and are holding me on. I'm on the floor next to this dripping urinal, and they're around me with these knives, and they intend to cut me up because of what a friend of mine did to their gang. They couldn't find him, so they grabbed me. And so I'm there going, wow, this is gonna like end much sooner than I thought. This is, I didn't know we were coming, and I'm scared and I don't know what to do. And then suddenly from inside me, a voice starts to tell a story. And it just comes out. In other words, I don't go, excuse me, I need a little rehearsal time. Just hold that attitude. It just came out in sentences and paragraphs, and it completely stopped their intention. And I watched these knives go down, and I watched that stare that people get when they're about to do harm disappear from their eyes. And they listened to me, and then they let me go. And again, it's in the book, and I describe what happens and what it was like. But when I look back, I realize that's the second part of muthos and myth, which is telling the myth, telling the story. So in a 6-month period, I got to know the story a little bit, and I got to tell the story for the first time. So I'm calling that both fate and destiny. And I use that to describe the notion that fate often comes as limitation, even as a threat of death. Fate, fatality, fatal, they're all coming from the same root. And so what seems like life and death to our soul can be the exact circumstances in which our destiny, our genius, and those things awaken. I didn't understand it then. No one recognized it. I couldn't get anybody to help me figure it out. It was just something that happened. But using these terms, the genius in me woke up under the threat of being killed. It saved my life, and it began, even though I couldn't live with it at that time, it began the actual serious course of my life, which I pick up later. So let me go to that. So I'm using those things to describe, from my own experience, how fate comes in, grabs a hold of a person, and creates the circumstances through which the destiny can awaken. 7 years later, another act of fate. In the book, I describe how the word lot refers to a small piece of wood that is inside a big earthen jar that is shaken by the three sisters of fate each time a soul is born. They shake this big jar, and the little chips of wood come from the roots of the tree of life. This is the old myth, the story. And each time someone is born, a soul is born, they shake this big earthen jar and they roll out, and the first chip that comes out is the lot in life of that person. That's from which we get the word lottery. And on the back of the piece of wood is what's called a divine word. And that's this divinity in the soul of that child being born. It's the genius. It's not simply a word. It's the beginning of their inner language of their life. So I explained that, in the book as a story. But what happens later on is lottery becomes a big deal in American culture because of the draft involved with the Vietnam War. They go back to a lottery system. And so really, it's everybody's fate is being rolled out in front of everyone. You understand what I'm saying? I know some people in the room know exactly what I'm saying. People my age, you were worrying, if you were a young guy, if your number's going to be called. Are you going to? So I get my notice of induction into the Army. And I write back and I say, near as I can tell, it's not a declared war. And near as I can tell, it's true, it was never declared. And I was reading, I was a studious little wise guy. And I said, and then the reasons have never been made clear, at least not to my understanding. And for those reasons, I think I won't come. But if you have another war, send another thing, It didn't go over well. So then the next thing happens is I get another letter saying, show up at the draft board or you will be going to jail. So I show up. Anyway, one thing leads to another. For various reasons, under various kinds of pressure, and in my own inner fear, I go into the Army. I get in there, and turns out that what they do a lot in the Army is give you orders. And I didn't know. And I don't do orders. I'm not good at that. And so what happens is I start saying, well, I'll do that order, but I'm not doing that one. And I think I'm being discreet. I'm using my education and my, self-awareness to distinguish between the orders, and they think I'm just disobeying and therefore a bad soldier, I guess. So then I wound up in prison. And then it turns out, this is all described in the book, but it turns out in prison, what they do is they give you more orders. And I said, didn't you get the memo? This is the whole point here. So then I turn out to be a bad prisoner because I won't, and then I go to solitary confinement. So I'll just pick that story up here. Although I was already confined and out of contact with everyone except the prison guards, I somehow remained a problem to the military. Officers continue to appear and give me orders as if my refusal to comply threatened everything they believed in. It really was like that. They were really threatened, and they didn't want anybody to know that someone could actually do this, defy it. And so they actually moved me to a prison cell. I was in Panama. We had been going through jungle training when I realized this wasn't going to work out. And so they put me in a prison cell that had not been used since the building of the Panama Canal. It was completely hidden place. I was under 24-hour armed guard. Each officer seemed to think that he had the magic power or unique style that would cause me to obey. As the situation deteriorated and greater punishments loomed, I suddenly decided to fast, and I began to refuse all food. My idea was to demonstrate that I wasn't present in any normal sense. If I didn't eat, I couldn't be considered to be present and participating in any way. To further make the point, I threw out my uniform and bedding and lived naked and solitary in my cell. Strange behavior, to be sure, but not completely out of context or out of character, as I found out later when I read about Irish political prisoners fasting against the British and dying rather than be forsaking their vision of sovereignty and justice. In other words, if you remember Bobby Sands, those that are older, Bobby Sands and the IRA prisoners fasting against Britain, and they were dying. And I found that out. That happened after I got out. And I read about that, and I realized it was something Irish that had kicked in. This is another element of fate, an ancestral Irish fate that said, if I can't beat you with force, I'm going to beat you by fasting against you. That's the only way I could understand what had happened, because I refused to eat. I didn't eat for 2 months. So I went from 153 pounds down to 87 pounds. And they were telling me every night that I was about to die. So I'm calling this fate, this process in which these things start to happen that I don't know why I'm doing it, and yet it's changing my whole life. There I was, barely over 20, alone and isolated, caught up in a cause that gripped me and would not let me go, hard fasting against them in order to make the point clear. For fate places people in unremitting circumstances and forces surprising qualities to the surface. The fellow in the cell next to me went the other way entirely. He swallowed strange objects, including some nuts and bolts, under the theory that eating hardware would prove him too disturbed to remain in the military. I'm refusing to eat anything. He's eating everything. And, we just went different ways. Although the scheme had some of Ulysses in it. Earlier, I'm telling the story of Ulysses, because Ulysses tried to get out of the Trojan War. He was one of my heroes. The guards simply took him to the hospital, where they x-rayed him and surgically removed all the nuts and bolts. Later, they returned him to his platoon, sent him off to the battlefield, and charged him for the surgery to boot. I decided to stick with my plan of refusing to eat until I received a discharge and could return home. I remained alone in my cell day after day, night after night, only leaving for a shower every other day. That's when I drank water. Eventually, doctors who specialized in the effects of starvation were brought in, and they told me I would die at any moment. Still, I would not eat. Something had been triggered deep inside me, and I had found my battle. Despite losing well over a third of my body weight and being warned that my organs were failing, I would only agree to eat when I received discharge papers. In a strange way, I had found an adventure that took all my energy and all my will, and that almost cost my life. Next part, I'll just describe it. So now I'm in this cell for a long time by myself. I'm a little over 20 years of age, and I don't really know what's going on. And I think maybe I've gone off the deep end. And I'm in solitary confinement, but I have regular visitors, except they're not like people. They're characters from stories. And characters from myth are showing up in the cell, and I'm having discussions with them about the stories they were in and about the world. And I realize I'm either losing my mind or I'm finding my mind. And I'm hoping it's the latter. The other things that's going on that I described in here, I've never talked about it really or written about it before, is at night all the officers in the, there's 2 forts near there, from the forts are coming in to visit me. And they come in and they give me an order when they enter, because that's kind of what they do. And then I say, remember, I'm not doing that. I don't use, maybe I was a little bit more rude in my language. But anyway, I tell them, forget the order. And then they drop that and they sit down and they begin to confess. And every one of them, the captains, lieutenants, the colonel, the general, come in and confess. They tell me, one tells me he's beating his wife and he feels terrible about it. Another one tells me he's become an alcoholic. I'm sitting there hearing confessions. I am, by then I have long hair and a beard and I'm skinny and I have no clothes on. I guess they thought I was Jesus. And having been raised as a Catholic, I'm given absolution, and advising them, So anyway, that all happens. But the part I wanted to get to was this. Eventually, 3 times they offered me discharge papers. The first 2 times they offered to make me an officer as soon as I signed. So that I don't know what this was, but I said, I really don't respect you guys to begin with. And now it's like, are you kidding? Anyway, the 3rd time they come in, they said, it's just a straight discharge. If you sign this, you can go home tomorrow. But by then I'm used to saying no. I've been in this no thing for a long time. When I refused to sign, an entire group of officers gathered to convince me that there was precious little time left. For the real cause for concern turned out to be that a U.S. senator had sworn to come and see the situation firsthand if I were not released from that prison. And it was not just any senator, it was Robert Kennedy himself. He had become the senator from my home state, and someone had gotten a message to him telling him of my struggle and my precarious condition. Apparently, he had called the commanding officer and insisted that I be released, or he would come in person within 48 hours. No one involved wanted Bobby Kennedy poking around in the back rooms and hidden cells of the Army. The authorities did not want the situation to become public and turn into a media event. There were already many soldiers interested in how I was faring and considering whether there was a way out of the armed service. This is true. One of the biggest conversations amongst those that were drafted was, is there a way out of this? This was not something that people were looking forward to. Suddenly, there was a big rush to give me my discharge papers and get me out of Panama as soon as humanly possible. Eventually, I got out. I signed it. I got out. Here's the part I wanted to get to. Well, I'm not going to be able to find it, so I'll just tell you. So then 2 years ago, I'm doing a workshop in Santa Cruz, California, and I'm talking about fate and destiny. And I happen to mention this detail about Bobby Kennedy getting me out of prison. And there's a woman in the workshop who worked on one of the biographies of Bobby Kennedy. And she says, I've got to tell you something. And I said, what? And she said, do you know what he was reading at that time? And I said, no. And she said, this is well known. After John Kennedy had been assassinated, Bobby stopped eating and he was losing weight really rapidly. And they referred to him in all the biographies, his clothes are hanging off him and he's in deep despair, way beyond depression. And Jackie Kennedy goes to him and says, here's some things I think you need to read, because they'll give you the old ideas of fate and understanding how people live with burdensome fates. And she gives him Edith Hamilton's Mythology and the Greek Way. And this woman in the workshop 2 years ago tells me what he was reading when he made that phone call was the book that I got on my 13th birthday. See what I mean? Fate and destiny? That is a strange thing. I just saw her 2 weeks ago again, and she's sending me all this additional information. So that's just a detail that took years. I just found that out recently. All right. So I get out, and then I'm still bone thin, and I'm being escorted back to the States by two sergeants returning back from their second tour in Vietnam. And they're both armed because I have to have armed guards wherever I go, and I'm chained to them. I'm handcuffed, and we're on a military plane. Everybody on there is rotating back from most are rotating back from Vietnam, and people are upset with me. I clearly don't look like a soldier, and the word has been passed around that I'm a traitor and so on. Go ahead this here. The sergeants asked why I was so emaciated and bearded and decidedly strange looking. Although I feared it would make me seem like the enemy to them, I told them that I had refused orders and wound up in solitary confinement. To my great surprise, they both felt that I had been in my own war, and they assured me that I had won. Where I expected them to attack me for standing against a war that they had barely survived, they felt we had each entered our own battles and received our own wounds. Where I was confused and still caught in a struggle to survive, they were newly released from war and wanting me to feel that freedom as well. It's strange to consider, but those warriors took me to be a brother in arms, or at least one who had fought in his own way. Although they were only ordered to deliver me to my base, they stayed with me throughout the contentious discharge process. They could see that I was fragile and still being threatened by many hardline military types. After their official guard duties were complete, they decided to continue as my protectors. They went wherever I went, and even gave up off-duty passes when I got in a little trouble before leaving the base. I've never seen them again, but I've never forgotten their instinctive integrity and their care and kindness towards me. So this is another twist of fate in the sense that these guys wind up blessing my situation, where I expected them, like others, to curse me. And that's another surprising thing that happens. And so anyway, I go on to talk about that. And so in a way, those three pieces, getting the book on my 13th birthday, getting attacked 6 months later while I was 13, and then having this life-threatening experience in the military, are what gave me a realization that there is fate in life and that there is also hints of destiny. So that's what's in the beginning of the book. And then I go on from there to get into more like mythology and folk tales in order to open this up to suggest that this is what happens really to everybody. That might be a little bit of an extreme story, but the core of it is the same thing that I think is trying to happen to everybody. And in order to do that, I need to talk a little bit about the soul. Give a sense of what the soul is. So this is a little piece on the soul. Soul, S-O-U, S-O-L, and soul, S-O-L-E, are related words that have shared roots. S-O-L-E, soul, carries the meaning of being the only one of its kind, as with an exceptional item or a unique and extraordinary person. And soul, S-O-L-E, can also mean the bottom of one's feet. In order to become a unique and extraordinary person, we must walk our walk and move the way that our soul would have us move. We must find the original speech of the soul and become the vehicle of its true expression. The Old English word soul, S-A-W-O-L, speaks with the same soulful tone of the spiritual and emotional parts of a person, the things that animate their being and resonate with the song of existence. The purpose of life can be seen as an effort to create and make more soul and thereby bring more of the song of existence into being through us. The only way to accomplish such a lofty goal is to draw energy from below as well as from within one's soul and bring it up and out into the light of day. When that happens, it happens in a unique way in which each soul sings its inner tune and each pair of feet find their own way to the great dance of life. The soul can be found as the physical foundation of the body and the feet, just as the soul, S-O-U-L, must become the inner foundation of the deep root of our lives. The soul within us is secretly connected to the spirit of earth itself and to the living earth, and the living earth has an interest in the growth of our own individual soul. For it was some aspect of earthly life that first drew our souls down into this world where meaning and beauty must be shaped from a union of matter and spirit held together by the soul. I go on and talk in many ways about the soul being uniquely gifted. So what I'm trying to get at there is each person is S-O-L-E, a unique expression of life. If we don't live our life, no one ever will. People will live many other lives, and hopefully there'll be many people that come to live after us, but they will never live our life. Our life, you could say we're each a body wrapped around a soul in which is buried a dream. And if we don't live out that dream, that inner story, that hidden design, no one else will ever do it. And one reason I'm writing about it and trying to draw on all different old cultures and stories from different traditions is because, in a sense, this is what's missing in the modern world. The modern world is about the external, not the internal. It's about the material, not the deeply soulful or imaginal or spiritual. And everything in the modern world is against the individual. To become oneself is swimming straight upstream now, because each person is considered part of a demographic group or part of a gender or part of a red state or a blue state or whatever that is. People are not considered to be the embodied version of a unique life. And in order to become uniquely oneself, which, as I understand it, is the job of life, in order to do that, a person must struggle against the kind of daily atmosphere of the world, which is really deadening to the soul. And so that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And so I come at it throughout the book in many different ways. Part of it, I talk about calling and the idea that each of us is called to this moment of awakening. So if you take what I said earlier, that the soul forgets why it came to life, then somewhere in youth, something begins to call us back. It's like a recalling back to why we came. So let's say in my case, I'm using my own life as an example. Part of the reason, maybe the main reason of my life is to learn, to tell, to work with stories and myths. I mean, that's what my life has become about, and I'm very glad it has become about that. But that started to announce itself when I was 13. And so when we do workshops, what I suggest to people is you look back through your life and back to the occasions in youth that are indelible. And you, regardless of whether they're good or bad, you could look back at that occasion where I'm about to be cut up with knives, and that could look like a bad thing. But that was enough pressure and enough danger to awaken the seed that was inside me, which was the storytelling mythology seed. Do you get what I'm saying? So one of the tricks is to look at one's own life, and it could be an illness, it could be getting thrown out of school, it could be having a severe accident, it could be loss of a loved one. It doesn't matter. Whatever the indelible occasions are, those are the occasions, the circumstances in which one's genius, one's calling, tries to awaken. And so throughout the book, I give all these different stories about from different cultures about why this is so or how this is so, because this is one of the universal stories. The fact that the soul is gifted, and the fact that it takes danger and trouble and pressure for those gifts to come out. So I'll just read this little piece here. In this life, a pious journey is required. It is pious in the sense of a path that brings out our devotion to life, but also because it cleanses and clarifies one's sense of self. The result may be pious, yet the process may look and feel like a stripping down to bare bone. From the common comforts, we must go to the edge of life. From simple assurance, we must go to the extremes of our nature. The inner thread of one's vocation began in the other world, and it will lead us in that direction again. The importance of others and of otherness is a part of the revelation of our souls seeking something other inside us all along. People say that what we seek to find in the world already resides in ourselves, but only after reaching some extreme limit or margin of life can we locate it. For what we search for is both part of us and other to us. It is an other that is also us, an other self. It is the true self hidden within us. The necessary resources may lie within, yet we must go far out into the world before we learn how to trust what is within us all along. The hardest thing to trust in this world tends to be our own selves. Before we can learn of the other within us, we must experience the otherness around us. Each life involves an essential errand, not simply the task of survival, but a life mission embedded in the soul from the very beginning. Life is an experiment in which we attempt to decipher the errand that the divine has sent us on. Any true calling has something of the divine in it, and what calls to us is of the gods. For our dreams and visions are given by the divine, and the gods have an interest in the paths we take in this world. I talk in there about how another meaning of fata, the original Latin word for fate, is what the gods say of us. What the gods say of us. In other words, what happens in the individual human life, according to mythology, is of interest to the gods and the goddesses, those beings in the other world. The nature of the soul and the story of the soul is a thing of great interest to the divine. I mean, I don't know how else to talk about it. Once you get into this area, I just couldn't avoid it, so I just started laying out this thing about the divine errand of the soul. What calls us is greater than our little self and is mostly at odds with the common beliefs and accepted way of our daily lives. The problem here on earth isn't a lack of calling. The problem is the lack of following what beckons to us far enough to learn our true nature. I'm going to read that again. That's not bad. The problem isn't a lack of calling. The problem is a lack of following what beckons to us far enough to learn its true nature. So much of life becomes arranged to obscure and distract us from what has called us to life in the first place. People easily misplace their deepest longings and tune themselves to someone else's idea of a life. Most people remain unwilling to be extravagant enough to wander where the soul would lead them, and instead simply adapt to an endless series of short-term goals. I'm arguing for the pious life, the reckless adventure of life, the adventure of the experiment of becoming oneself, and I'm arguing that there really is nothing else to do. And not really. The rest of it is distraction. There's a section in here where I talk about the golden self. I'll just summarize that to say that following ancient stories and also recent Jungian psychology, the deep self in each person is a golden seed. In other words, what's hidden inside each person is something as valuable as gold, and not just for the one carrying it, but for everybody else as well. When someone finds their gift and gives it, it benefits everyone else. And so it's the most altruistic thing to do, as well as the most self-serving thing to do, in the best sense of that. And then I have a chapter in here called What Not to Forget. And I talk quite a bit about youth and the calling that happens in youth. And then I wanted to talk about the elders, or as I call them now, the olders. And I make a distinction between olders and elders based on an old African proverb that says white hair doesn't make the elder. Everybody grows older, but not everybody grows wiser. And the elders are, by virtue of becoming wise, the dispensers of spiritual and emotional medicine. That's the role of the elders in a culture. Notice nowadays the elders are in line to receive drugs. Something has gone wildly awry. And the second way you know that something is wrong, I call it the great forgetting, in which the elders were, you lose short-term memory, just the way your eyesight fails. The way I think about it is this. After about 40 years, you've seen enough. You know what I'm saying? The point isn't seeing more. The point is developing vision. And after a while, you lose short-term memory in order to gain the long-term memory. And long-term memory is the real vital things of a culture. The elders were the ones who remembered what it was all about. Now you have more and more people living older and older, but not necessarily becoming wiser. I'm just talking in general. I'm not referring to your relatives. And but also nowadays, people are forgetting who they are before they die. This is really a radical and unusual thing. You're supposed to remember who you are and know your story before you die. And when you die, you're supposed to die standing knee deep in your own story and fully aware of who you are. You get what I'm saying? And something is gone, I call it the great forgetting, because people are forgetting who they are. And one suggestion I make in the book is that if people didn't awaken to the calling in their life early on, it may become easier to forget what your life was later on. You get what I'm saying? If we didn't live our life, but lived everybody else's life, which is what, Glenn Beck would prefer, then what happens at the end, we can't remember who we are because we didn't become who we were, if you get my drift. So I have a whole chapter on the great forgetting. I'll just summarize it. And I use the story, the famous old story, Hasidic story, of the teacher who's dying. And the students say, what is it like dying? His students who love him. He's a rabbi. And he says, well, I'm afraid of what God's going to say to me. And they say, how could you be afraid? You're like the best teacher we ever had. You have the vision of Abraham. You have the courage of Moses. How could you be afraid? And he says, well, if God asked me, wasn't I more like Abraham? I will say, because I wasn't intended to be Abraham. If he says, why weren't you more like Moses? I will say, because I was never supposed to be like Moses. But if he says, why weren't you more like yourself? For that, I have no answer. So I take that story and that idea and I cook it down at the end of this chapter to this simple thing. Most cultures believe that when a person dies, there is some kind of judgment at the end, a final test. And I'm suggesting here that it's not an essay test at the end, and it's not multiple choice. That there's only one question at the end: did you become yourself? Did you become yourself? And that's actually how I also end the book. So let me go to the end of the book here. After a whole bunch of stories about the golden self and the gifted self, stories, all kinds of cultures, spiritual journeys, everything I could pack in here, you have to put an ending on a book. We live in radical times, surrounded by tasks that seem impossible. You know what I mean? How do you deal with the climate issues? How do you deal with the collapse of culture, whether it's banking or education or healthcare? They all seem impossible. It has become our collective fate to be alive in a time of great tragedies, to live in a period of overwhelming disasters, and to stand at the edge of sweeping changes. The river of life is flooding before us, and a tide of poisons affect the air we breathe and the waters we drink, and even tarnish the dreams of those who are yet young and still innocent. The snake-bitten condition of the world has already spread poison throughout the collective body. However, it is in troubled times that it becomes most important to remember that the wonder of life places the medicine of the self near where the poison dwells. The gifts always lie near the wounds. The remedies are often made from poisonous substances, and love often appears where deep losses become acknowledged. Along the arc of healing, the wounds and the poisons of life create the exact opportunities for bringing out all the medicines and making things whole again. Meanwhile, fate keeps troubling the soul and even endangering the world until people accept that some deep truths must be faced. When the time for healing comes, those who are closest to the wounds will be better able to face the truth and start the healing. I'm using this old idea that the ones on top are the last ones to find out what's going on and the last ones to really find the medicine in life. That those of us who are willing to suffer, I call it facing our fate, are actually closer to the healing. Anybody doing therapy knows that. Anybody doing healing knows that. You first have to open the wound and clean it before the healing can start. And then you remember, if it's a wound in the body, once it closes and the scar tissue grows over it, that is the strongest tissue in the human body is scar tissue. So I'm talking about this healing process that begins with facing the dark truths and dealing with the wounds. When there's no time, I'm referring to a story here, when there's no time for sending out for physicians or waiting for magical antidotes, the medicine must be found within, and it only requires an act of truth to activate the cure. Each soul has something to contribute in terms of the inner truth, and each has a part of the remedy needed for the world at this time. It may be our mutual fate to be present when the poisons that have long festered become undeniable. The child of the future has already been bitten by the snake of the past. If so, the questions that everyone faces are similar to the ones asked in the stories. I'm referring to a bunch of stories in here. It is in troubled times that it becomes most important to remember that the wonder of life prices the medicine of the self where the poison dwells. The gifts, I think I just read that. Okay. It's the same question that the divine asks several ways during the course of life that gets asked again at the end of each life's unique adventure. In the midst of all the confusion in the great marketplace of life, did you live the life seated in your soul to begin with? In the twists of fate, did you find the thread of destiny intended for you to follow? Did you become weird enough and finally wise enough to become yourself? That's the end. So we have time for some questions if people have questions. If you can get on the gradient of your life, which is like an invisible thread that is really pulling us along if we allow it to happen, then things begin to fall towards one's favor. Protection and possibilities occur that otherwise wouldn't be there. And the more we wander away from this invisible gradient that is set into our lives, the more we are in danger, the more confused we get, the more we can fall into depression or despair or whatever the thing happens to be. So I agree with you on that. Way back there.
This sounds unrelated. Do you have an idea of what is the source or cause of cruelty?
The source or cause of cruelty. Well, since I'm standing up here, I'll answer as if I know. I mean, I have some experience with it, but I think the source of cruelty is partially ignorance. And by that I mean, if I don't know who I am, it's very easy for me to treat you as someone less than me or less than you. In other words, I'm more cruel the less knowledge I have of my own self. When a person knows themselves, they know that they are wounded. To be human is to be wounded. And when I know my wounds, I can more easily recognize the woundedness in other people and have less of a desire to add to the wounds of others. So I think it begins in a kind of self-ignorance. Being born in America is a very dangerous thing because of the pretense of freedom and because of the ideas that pass around, like you can be anybody you want to be. I mean, that's just not true. You really can't be anybody you want to be. You're lucky if you turn out to be who you're supposed to be. You know what I'm saying? I hope that, really, when I was 13, besides getting that book, I was certain that I was born to be a basketball player. Because I just loved to play basketball. And I had I could dribble with either hand way before that was fashionable. But I had a big shortcoming, so to speak, which is I come from a noticeably short family. And you think I would have had a clue about that. But I had been drinking the water of America that said you could be anybody. And I thought I was going to be tall any minute. I'm joking around, but you can't be anybody you want to be. And I'm suggesting this other thing, that it's a kind of a cruelty to pretend to people that they can do anything. In the old conversation, choice is not near as important as being chosen. Being chosen means to be called, and it's way more important than having a bunch of choice. I mean, I think if there is going to be choice, everybody should have choices. It should be an even playing field. That's fine. But what counts in life is being called and being chosen to be in a certain kind of life. And I think less cruelty happens when people find their own road in life, because each road of life will be marked with wounds as well as gifts. To be alive is to be wounded. That's an old idea. And you don't necessarily get cured before the end. Some curing occurs, but you don't go out the door perfectly fine. I don't think that's what it's about. The idea is to go out the door, singing the song that makes sense, which could be the blues. And it could be, the song of life includes the awareness of woundedness, which makes us sympathetic, empathic, and compassionate, as well as the song of one's gifts, which get polished by being given. Yes.
Righteousness. You mentioned cruelty.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your observation is on righteousness, because there's a lot of that out of the country right now.
If you take the notion of the majority of the population not knowing who they are, education doesn't aim to teach you or help you awaken to who you are. As a matter of fact, modern education helps you to become someone else. It's all about career now, instead of about vocation. So what happens is you have people that are basically empty, more or less empty of knowledge of who they are and what the world is about. And so deep down, I think they're terribly afraid. I would be if I had no idea who I was. But they don't want to live in that fear, so they reach out for a false certainty. Tea Party, a false certainty. They reach out for something that seems to answer everything and become self-righteous instead of self-knowing. That's one way I would explain it. And of course, this is played out in religious terms as well. In the book, I write a little bit about religion, along the lines of saying that if we're on a divine errand, it would make sense that we'd visit some religious groups, and that religions are, in a certain sense, there to help people find the way to a greater life. But a person never can find all the way that they're going from any philosophy or any religion. I don't think so. A certain point along the way, a person has to make their own path, make the path by walking. They used to call it, in mythology, they call it the pathless path. And at that point, you step away. And it's always been ironic to me that the people that are most revered, whether it's Christ or Jesus or Muhammad or whoever it might be, all broke the rules. They're all people who went off the beaten path and started their own path. And then the people that follow them say you have to act just like them. And I go, yeah, well, I am acting like them. I'm breaking the rules. That's what they did. You get what I'm saying? You get the irony? Buddha went right against Hinduism and Jainism and started a whole new way of being. I mean, he was very gentle about it, but he upset the entire Hindu world. And so then the notion isn't to become like anyone else, it's to do what the great leaders and the great mystics have done, become oneself, because that's what they did, my thought. And then it's very hard to be self-righteous if you're in the struggle to be self-aware. Yes.
I want to thank you for the reminder that helps me wake up and see about destiny. And how I have been increasingly in these times more isolated
Yeah.
because of the way things are
Yeah.
around me. But there used to be more people sharing information with you along the way, markers along the way to kind of help me reawaken about the hope inside and finding my destiny. And I was wondering if you could address the fact that I don't really see that so much anymore. It feels more and more isolating all the time.
Mainstream culture is really mass culture. And the massing of it obliterates the sense of the unique individual. And it obliterates, in a way, the very weirdness of life. I talk in the book about how a person's job is to become more and more weird. That weird is an old word that means to have a foot in each world. And we're supposed to get stranger as we get older. And you know, more uniquely, bizarrely ourselves. And if more people were doing it, we'd all be encouraged to be more weird, and we'd be having a much better time. But we happen to be living during a time of mass culture where everything looks more and more like itself. And what that does is it rejects the soul. And so one way you know that there's less soul in the world is because everybody's fighting about everything. When the soul is present, people find conversation. They find ways to connect. So we're living in a mass culture that rejects the subtleties of the soul, and that causes us to feel more and more isolated. And that's another reason I wrote the book and why I talk about the things I talk about. I work with young people all the time, and it's just not, I see the pain they're in. They don't see a place in the world for them. They don't see a world that makes sense to them. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Culture was formed to make a welcome for young people. And so they are suffering a tremendous loss of the soul just when they should be stepping into the soul. And I happen to think that because, you know, I just got the statistic the other day, 50% of the world are now, of the people in the world are now over 50. That's pretty dramatic. Two things that just happened. They just calculated that the number of people alive now is equal to the number of people who were ever alive before. That's the first statistic came out just a few months ago. And the second one, of all this great number of people in the world, 50% of them are over 50. So that suggests to me that the hidden unity behind life is trying to create a group of elders, a group of people that would be wise enough to bring back the notion of living with meaning and living for the individual value of life, and that is what creates community, and that's what could restore culture and even assist nature. And so I feel like we're in a struggle for that, and that it's a personal struggle to be an individual, but the benefit of doing it serves other people as well. That's one reason I wrote the book. Yes.
Michael, one of the things that, among many, that really captured me when you were speaking was your story about having a connection with your Irish ancestry without knowing it.
Yeah.
In your belligerent not eating. And I wondered whether you could say something about that ancestral faith, which is what I think you were alluding to.
Yeah, I think it's an ancestral level of fate. I'll just try and do this quickly because I do it most places where I speak. One of the big damages in the massing of culture is the idea of whiteness. What I mean is the idea of being a white person is only a couple of 100 years old. It's a couple of 100-year-old bad idea. And here's what I mean. You know that thing where they say, why don't you just go back where you came from? Well, there's no white land. There's Scotland and Ireland. There's even Greenland. But there is no white land. So no one came from there and no one can come back there. But what people could go back to is the land that they came from, because everybody is really part of the folk. We all come from land somewhere. And so it happened to me twice in my younger days that I felt the presence of something very Irish and ancestral, and it made a huge difference in my life. And the only way I could understand it, it was an ancestral force that was somehow, nowadays, I think it's in the bones. I think it lives in the bones. And under pressure, it can awaken. And not to say that everything Irish is great, but what it means is there are people that came from the ground. They had a mythology, they had a mysticism, and they had ways of understanding the world that were deep and beautiful. And that was residing in me. And when I researched it, I found this very basic thing. When the Irish, who were a small, we call it a nation, they were a small clan, really, when they could not by force win the battle, they would begin to fast against whoever they were enemies with. And that darn thing woke up in me, because where else would that come from? It just came into me, and I had to do it. After that, I never identified as white again. I identified as Irish. It made such a difference to me. See, one of the problems with mass culture and white culture, whatever you want to call it, is it has no past. It's based on everybody not understanding the past and all being predicated upon a future that's supposed to be better. And so what happened is you have people without a background. You have people without deep standing behind them. And that's not, I would say that's not normal for humans. Humans are supposed to have the sense that we're coming from somewhere. Now, there is one benefit. If you've been separated from your ancestral past, then you do get to choose amongst them. You know what I'm saying? This is my kind of, this is the reward for reclaiming ancestry. You don't have to reclaim them all. It's very helpful for a lot of white folks. But anyway, just joking. But the idea is, see, like right now, every time someone dies, they become an ancestor. And one of the biggest ancestors in American culture is Martin Luther King. You know what I'm saying? People refer to him in an ancestral sense. And that shows you that you can actually borrow ancestors from other traditions. And why is that valuable? So as not to be standing in the midst of the storm of the modern world like one little isolated person with no roots and no background and no backup to speak of. You know what I'm saying? That's a terrifying thing, and no one can do that. And so in my case, both sides of my family are from Ireland. And by the time I got out of that prison, now I found out another thing later. This is interesting. Turns out that the Irish, when they go into war, they go in naked. That helped me understand what I did. I was naked. I was fighting. I mean, otherwise I was a little crazy dude. But it turned out that I wasn't just that. I was like a little Irish dude. That's how I understand what happened. And it gave me a sense of depth and background. And it gave me an understanding that the warrior doesn't have to go to war. It's the soldier that has to go to war. The warrior can pick the battle, which is another old Irish idea, because there's a myth about that. The Irish don't fight every fight. They pick the battle based on how they feel spiritually, actually. That's what's in the old myths. So I don't know if that helps with that. Anyone else? Yes.
I've been listening to you for a long time, and I just want to say thank you for sharing your personal stories.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I find that actually awkward, and as I'm getting older, I'm sharing more of it. I often haven't known what to make of it. But in this book, I just felt like I had to explain why I'm thinking about these things, and then just for those that are getting older in the room, it's on what? We're all getting older in the room, but I mean noticeably older. One of the weird things about Veterans Day is that typically the veterans haven't told their stories. I remember a couple years ago hearing an NPR story on Veterans Day, and it was this man who finally told the story because he was the only one left after the ship went down and everyone else got eaten by sharks. And he had held on to this thing in the cold waters while everyone else went down, but he never told the story because he had post-traumatic stuff. And then his grandchildren convinced him to tell the story, and he came on the radio to do it because that whole generation is dying. And these are stories that would never be heard. And so as I listened to that, I realized that's right. As we get older, we have a responsibility to tell the story, because what's in the mass culture is not the story of human lives. It's a story of pretension. It's a story of distraction. It's the story of distortion. And so I think it becomes the responsibility of those who could qualify as elders to tell their story as it seems to them, because it could be helpful to younger people. And then there's another piece in it that actually comes, an African friend of mine reminded me that when you tell your story, you're more alive. And when other people tell your story, it keeps you alive. So there's another whole thing. Yeah, so there's self-interest involved in it. Yes.
When you talk about inherited faith, for family, I'm wondering if there might be one for our culture or for America or for people on the planet that, because we're in such trying times, our destiny, our gifts can come forward now. Is there a story that goes with this?
Our individual destiny?
Our collective destiny.
Or the collective destiny is being challenged right now. I mean, America, if you want to call it that, is in this crux. Either people will act in the interest of the general good. Remember, this is the place that said, bring me your poor and all the refugees. Remember, that's the story of America. That's what everybody loves about America. And either America will begin to live that story again and forget about this self-interest and this radical defense of material goods and all this kind of stuff. Either that's going to happen, or the times are going to become much darker. I mean, that's the crises I think that we're in. And it's being played out to economic policy, but it's also a spiritual crisis. I mean, when I listen to the argument that's going on in the culture, it seems to lack spiritual intuition. It seems to lack, the sense that a culture is formed to take care of people. That's what it's supposed to be doing. And now they're arguing about who gets to be part of that. This thing about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. We're in the greatest stretch of disparity between those two groups that has ever happened in American history. And that's a sign of the isolation of the soul, because the soul would bring everybody closer back together. And they can prove now that as the disparity gets greater, more and more people get serious illnesses. Not just the poor, but the wealthy get it as well, because secretly we are part of a shared soul. And so, yeah, this is a time that challenges the soul of humanity. I think it's going to be on that way for a while, by the way. We're going to be in the dark times for a while. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm writing about and suggesting if we can each find some part of our individual destiny, that begins to alter the situation. I don't think we're going to vote the answer in. I don't think it's going to come that way. I should mention that where I find people picking up their threads of destiny and getting these senses of self-revelation is in all the dark parts of the culture, in hospice work, in youth work, in places where people are homeless, and places where other people don't want to go. No one ever became themselves while they were comfortable. It always happens under stress and distress. And one of the old ideas is you look around, whatever looks darkest to you, go in that direction. Because there you are bound to find something that can challenge your soul. And maybe it doesn't feel good, I don't think it does, but darkness is gathering in almost all directions. And so it really is a time, as I was trying to say there at the end, of tremendous opportunity for those who are willing to struggle to have integrity in their lives and find this thread of destiny. I think actually it's a good time for that. And it's maybe only things like that that could get us through these times, is how I'm thinking. So are we there? Have we reached the conclusion? They're saying yes. I want to thank you all for coming out, for being interested in this. Thank you. I'll sign books over there.